I was getting awards from the church for things I was doing in the church, but in secret, I was an alcoholic and trying to hide that side of me. My 4.5-year-old son was killed by a drunk driver, and that really deepened my faith journey because I was confronted with just an existential pain. And in that moment, I was freed from a tremendous burden of loneliness, feeling like I couldn't share with people.
Well, this is the INNOVAT Podcast, and I'm here with my good friend David Balch. Thank you so much for joining me. We've been looking forward to talking to you. So this INNOVAT Podcast is all about, the ideas we've innovated. We're in Silicon Valley. You're in the Monterey Bay area. We're in San Francisco Bay Area. We've innovated. I got a supercomputer on my wrist that I'm pretty sure this little thing can beat, hands down, the world's smartest chess player. And yet during the same time, we're still the problems that are most important, like homelessness, human trafficking, unequal access to justice, those have gotten worse while we're innovating and changing the world. So Innovate is all about talking about social impact leaders like yourself. So David, you're a lawyer and a homeless advocate, and you run a homeless ministry in Chinatown and Salinas. So why don't you do an introduction for our guests?
Sure, my name is David Balch, originally from the East Coast. Moved out here when I was 32 years old with my wife, attorney at a big firm in New York City. And then my wife wanted to move out here when she got out of medical school. And we could have gone to Chicago, Dallas, San Francisco, stay in New York, or move to Salinas, California. And I was like, oh, Lord. And
So just that you got the little smile.
She chose Salinas, and I was like, well, my legal career will look different. But on top of my legal career, I've always had a sort of a side gig of social justice. One of my clients' fathers in New York City, I was doing a pro bono case for a guy doing a criminal appeal. His dad asked me if I wanted to come into Rikers Island with him to do prison ministry. And I was like, there's no way.
So this is way back when you're in your 20s?
Back in 97, I was 27 years old. And I'm like, I'm some middle-class lawyer in a three-piece suit. What am I going to contribute in a maximum security prison? But after I was done with that first night, my life was changed. And sometimes I think we have in the back of our minds that question, who am I to do this? Who am I to go into a prison? And I quickly learned that that's a question put there by Satan, because we're all equipped, because when we share our lives with people and we're just journeying with people or we're making connections, that's the heart of it all.
Were you married at the time?
I was. And my wife came in with me. We had one night where it was my wife and I, 40 guys, and no guards. But I was like, oh, Lord, what am I in for? And that was one of the nights that changed my life. Just I felt joy connecting with other human beings.
You also have a great story of recovery yourself. What was the time frame on that? When was, and I know a bit of the story, but do you want to talk about that?
Sure. Unfortunately, growing up, I always felt like a bit of a misfit. And one of the ways
Up in New York.
In New York.
Okay.
I was...
City?
No, just north of the city. Went to a very wealthy high school, mostly Jewish wealthy high school, and I was the poor kid from the other side of the tracks.
Okay.
And I a lot of friends, say it wasn't like I was lonely per se, but I knew I didn't quite fit in. And one of the ways I used to get rid of that inner loneliness was alcohol.
When did that start?
Probably 14, 15 years old. And a lot of my high school years were spent drinking, and into college, into law school. When I met my wife, that subsided. But around 2011, 2012, just a lot of things happening in life, and it picked back up.
Were you in New York or in?
I moved out here in 2002. So I was here now, and I've been here for about 10 years.
Oh, okay.
And just traumas in my own life picked up, and it was
Marriage, life,
and
we'll do that.
started drinking a lot. And I remember having...
So you're in your 30s or early 40s?
I'm in my early 40s, and I was getting awards from the church for things I was doing in the church. But in secret, I was an alcoholic and trying to hide that side of me. And I remember the first time I really...
Were you aware, self-aware at the time that you were an alcoholic, or you justified it? Or were you?
I knew there was a problem, but all my friends drank more than I did. So I was like, well, I can't be an alcoholic because they all drink more than I do. But I knew it was affecting me. It was affecting my family. It was affecting my spiritual life. And actually, before I got sober, my wife had been in Al-Anon for a year, and I didn't even know. So obviously, she had seen something going off in the wrong direction. And really, without bringing me into that part of her journey, she started healing herself from what it's like to have an alcoholic husband.
Now you're Catholic now.
Correct.
Were you Catholic at the time, or because you weren't raised Catholic?
I was not raised Catholic. When I met my wife, I was 26, and she had been a missionary. She had worked with Mother Teresa for a little bit, and she was just the coolest person I'd ever met. She had a peace in her heart that I had looked for my whole life. And I was like, I'm marrying this woman. And she was Catholic. I started going to church with her, and it just felt like home. And this is in the late 90s. And I entered the Catholic Church in 1997 at the Easter Vigil. So I've now been Catholic for just over 50% of my life. So yeah, I'd been Catholic at that point for 18 years in 2015 when I finally got clean.
So that was a spiritual renewal, and that was also, you got clean, at least partially, from alcoholism. And okay.
Yeah, and
you moved to Salinas, life happens, and you backslide. You're drinking a lot while outside everything's looking awesome.
But even in Salinas, for the first 10 years we were there, life was really good. And as things were increasingly good, I started getting increasingly dark on the inside after about 10 or 12 years of that in Salinas. And so in 2015...
Life is good? So it wasn't external crises? Because you've been through some very, very difficult times. But it wasn't the external crisis that triggered you? It was you outside's looking good, but inside you're...
It's an interesting question, because in 2009, as you know, my 4.5-year-old son was killed by a drunk driver. And that really deepened my faith journey. Because I was confronted with just an existential pain. And I could either have run from God or just said, hey, I'm yours. And really, for the next couple of years, my faith journey deepened in a way that it was difficult for me to explain. But there was also a certain numbness that came about from my son dying that I never really dealt with. And over the next few years, as I started really dealing with all of the pain, all of the feelings of emotional abandonment, just my alcohol use started increasing. So it's interesting, as my faith journey is increasing, so was my alcohol use, which then really put a stop to any really spiritual development after a couple of years.
Very, very interesting.
And so I had a choice to make, do I want to be the person God created me to be, that I felt he was calling me to be, or was I going to be an alcoholic? And that's a tough choice, and it's interesting. That's
obviously you put it here, and it's like it's a rhetorical question, but it's hard at the time, asking that question is, 80% of the victory. The fact that you make it that clear. I can either turn my life around, or if I continue down this path, I'm going to be an alcoholic. I am an alcoholic. Once you get there, that's part of the way.
But I would suggest that it's not clear, and here's why. There's this great story in the Bible where Jesus asked the blind man, "What do you want me to do for you?" And that, in some ways, is the dumbest question in the Bible. Of course, I want to see. But do you really want to see? Because right now, all your needs are taken care of. You sit at the front gate. You're given money. You don't have to work. You're known by people. You have sympathy. When you walk around, people know who you are. There's a certain perverse, I wouldn't say pride, but something comes from that pain, a sense of self. And if you see now, if the blind man can see, his whole life is going to change. He has to go to work. He loses the pity party. He loses the sympathy. He loses the money at the gate. And that's a scary thought, because now he has to confront, what if I'm not good enough to work? Right now, I'm taken care of.
This is very real for you.
Yeah. You know what? In theory, I would love to not be an alcoholic. But now I've got to face all of my pain by myself and do it sober. At least alcohol let me escape from having to deal with a pain that was so deep. But what was so sad about the situation was that God was dealing with my pain through a peace I had never known. And it was like I just couldn't take that last step to fully trust him.
So simultaneously, I mean, this is the parable of the wheat and tares, Simultaneously you have this healing movement in your life, but simultaneously you're also resisting it.
Yeah.
And so I've seen that pattern in many others, as it gets better, it also gets worse. And the Lord allows that because then he's going to fully uproot the thing that was there that was dormant.
And one of the interesting things about me is I can find it difficult to trust. And I want to present the image that I want to present, and I want people to buy that image. And so I didn't want to tell my friends I'm an alcoholic. I was running retreats. I was giving them major talks on retreats. All, in my circle, people were looking up to me as sort of a spiritual leader. And so we were prepping for a retreat once. And I was like, there's no way in heck I can tell these guys what I'm really going through, because then their image of me will be shattered. And so it got to me, and we were praying over each other. And then they said, "David, what can we pray for you?" "Oh, good talk, maybe wisdom." I said, "No, I'm going to do it." And I said, "Guys, I'm an alcoholic." I started crying. And I know at that moment they're going to walk out of the room saying, "You're a fraud." But the opposite happened. One guy came over to me, gave me a big hug. One of the most spiritually deep guys I knew said, "I'm there too, brother." A couple other guys came over. I'm crying right now. A couple other guys came over, gave me hugs, and were like, "We're with you. You're not alone." And in that moment, I was freed from a tremendous burden of loneliness, feeling like I couldn't share with people what I was going through. And I learned in that moment that I was loved for me, and not because I could give a talk on a retreat or prayed well or anything else, but even when I confessed something dark, they said, "Brother, we love you." And that was healing on several different levels.
And then what happened?
Went to rehab.
Your wife played a role in this too, didn't she?
Oh, she did. She, at some point, finally said, "Listen, you're going to rehab, or I can't stay." And it wasn't mean. I got the sense of her saying, "I'm tired." So I went to rehab. I was actually sober for a couple of months before I went to rehab. I pushed it off for a couple of months, finishing up a project. Then I went into Betty Ford. I was there for about 35 days. And I came home on a weekend pass. And I knew my life was different because I had my two sons at the time, who at that point were 4 and 2 years old. And I'm holding their hands, walking down a pathway by my house. And after about 10 minutes, I was struck that I was enjoying holding their hands. I wasn't anxious to get back to the house because there was a drink waiting for me. I wasn't like, "Boys, this has been fun, but Daddy's got to get back to work." I just enjoyed holding my boys' hands. And I just kept walking with them. And in that moment, I knew that something had changed, that finally I had an inner sense of my role, my purpose, the beauty of God, and just, I was okay. I didn't need anymore. I didn't need alcohol, didn't need to run. In Psalm 23, I spent a banquet in front of you. I finally felt at peace to eat from that banquet.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful.
And I remember this 10 years ago now. I remember like it was yesterday.
That's beautiful. So then what?
So then I went on, the next year I went on a retreat, an 8-day silent retreat, a Jesuit retreat, which for a lawyer, 8 days of silence can be crazy, but I loved it. I just was able to think about what God had done in my life and meditate on it. When you speak it out, sometimes the power gets dissipated, but when you keep ruminating on it in your brain, it just keeps growing. So on the 4th day of this retreat, I was sitting in front of a statue of Jesus, and I said, okay, Lord, what do you want from my life? And an image of a homeless person sitting on a bench popped into my mind. And I was like, all right, God, what do you want me to do for this person? Do they need help with Social Security? Do they need help, a domestic violence restraining order? Like, I'm a lawyer. How can I help? Is it an immigration, question? And I felt God say, I don't want you to do anything for this person. I want you to sit next to them and talk with them. I was like, that's really nice, God, but no, seriously, what do you want me to do? And I just heard God say again to me, I don't want you to do anything. Just talk with this person as you would a brother. And part of me is thinking like, what good will that do? But I tucked it away in my heart, and I knew that God was calling me in a new direction. And it took a few years to fully implement, but in 2019, I got diagnosed with advanced colon cancer and was on disability for 3 years. And then COVID hits, just as I'm getting through treatment, COVID hits, and we're all locked in for the next year. But in early 2021, I was driving through Chinatown in Salinas, which is where a lot of the...
Yeah, it's like the Tenderloin in San Francisco.
Exactly. And there was a building for rent. So I called the person. I said, hey, I want your building. And he's like, what for? I was like, I'm not sure yet, but God's telling me to get this building. And so before I'd even formed my corporation, I signed the lease. And very quickly just started an outreach where we sat out front with a pot of coffee and some donuts and just talked with people. That was 4 years ago we started that, and that was the main goal, just to get to know people. I got to know this guy, Ron, who was larger than life. And we would share really smart guy. And we would share every day, just laughing, joking. You could tell he looks like he ran the place. And I asked him about being homeless. He said, oh, it's great. I have no bills. I'm having fun. I'm sleeping on my own. There's no rules. We got drugs. It's a constant party. And he kept playing it up. And I said, let me ask you a question. Will you be honest with me? He's like, yeah. And at this point, I had such a good relationship with him that I knew he'd be honest. And I said, are you happy? He started crying. He said, David, I'm not happy. All that bravado just melted away in that moment. I asked him why. He talked about his ex-wife and his kid that he can't see anymore. It breaks his heart. And part of me said, well, why don't you get your life back together so you can see them? But for whatever reason, he wasn't taking that option. And I knew there was a deep pain in there somewhere. So I said, hey, do you mind if I call your ex-wife for you? And he's like, sure, that'd be great. So I called his ex-wife. I asked her if she'd be willing to go out to lunch with him. She's like, heck no. I said, no, I'm going to be there too. I'll pay for it. It's a free lunch, and I'll make sure this guy stays, And she's like, you know what? That might be nice. So we all met up for lunch. I met this guy's ex-wife, his kid. It was a beautiful lunch. It was a reconciliation of sorts. Not they got back together, but they started talking. And then 2 months later, he died in a car accident. And part of me is like, Lord, if you were going to take him away so quickly, why even bother? But I think something in his soul was healed by that lunch and in the months after. And his ex-wife would call me when she needed help with something. I began just to realize that there's a community, that there's a soul-to-soul connection that goes far deeper than what we view as outreach to the homeless right now. It's not about serving food. It is about serving food and housing and everything else.
Well, but you go beyond serving food, having a meal together.
That's right.
It's the community. I love the whole concept of closer walk, that it's not just about the homeless. It's really about us walking closer with them. And when we care for them, we're now walking closer to God.
That's right. So every Saturday night we have dinner. And a lot of times you picture a dinner with the homeless. They come in, they get their tray, maybe they'll sit down somewhere, and then they'll head out. We do it outdoors. We've got a different church every week comes down, makes a beautiful spread. And we got live music playing and chairs out, and they just get to sit and hang out. Maybe we'll have a little table over here. Sometimes we'll have a little fire pit going. And I'll just walk around and chat with folks. But people from the churches come out from behind the table and sit down and chat with folks, pray with them, get to know them a little bit. So the homeless are like, who's coming this week? Oh, it's First Baptist. Oh, all right. They know the churches and they feel loved. But the whole vibe, I call it like a Thanksgiving dinner every week. It's just a bunch of folks coming together to have fun. And we get maybe 100 people for dinner. And yeah, a lot of them will come, grab food, and go to their tent. But maybe 50 will stick around for an hour and a half, just having community.
Yeah, one friend, Kevin Adler, who runs Miracle Messages. I don't know if you know him. Maybe a great connection. But he was describing homelessness, like even the term homeless, like that's intentionally been designed to compartmentalize it and say the issue is a house, put them in a house. So it's dehumanizing in a sense. The real issue is when they're a human being and they've broken their community relationships.
Yep.
They've broken them so much, they burned every bridge that they're all gone. And so the answer is not just a house, although that's needed. Shelter is deeply needed. The answer is community, and it's restoring them as a human being. And like what you said, getting to the root of this guy's pain.
Now the population, the group of folks I work with, it's chronic homelessness with significant drug abuse. So it's not representative of what we would consider homeless in general. But I think as we see driving out of this...
That term homeless in general, what does a 18-year-old who's fleeing, whatever from the West, coming to, getting struck out on drugs, what does he have in common with a woman who's maybe undocumented, who's fleeing domestic abuse with 2 kids? Not much in common. Or a veteran who's dealing with PTSD and for chronic, and he's been homeless for many, many years. It's a very, very diverse population. And we have terms like Latinx, which is politically correct because you don't call a Venezuelan a Mexican or a Brazilian a Mexican. They're very different, but we lump them all into the same category. We call them homeless. No, they're human beings.
Yep.
It's a diverse population.
Yeah, but the population, not again, of the chronically on the streets and drug addicted there for 5-10 years, is a subset of how the federal government would define homeless. But I was giving a talk at a local Lutheran church, and I said, I found the gateway drug to drug addiction and homelessness in Salinas. I know what the issue is. And they all leaned forward. They all wanted the answer.
Yeah, what is it?
Childhood trauma.
Yeah.
And I think they all wanted a simple answer. But the reality is everybody I journey with, almost everybody, has significant childhood trauma.
Praise God, that's starting to be addressed more. The whole term ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, and those are,
I had one guy come up to me. He said, "Can I share with you my story?" And I felt honored that he trusted me enough. And then he left for 45 minutes and didn't come back. It's like, okay. And when he came back, he was high as a kite. And he said, you know what, David, I apologize. I've never shared my story sober. And then when he shared his story with me, the deep pain that he carried from child abuse when he was 2 years old, 3 years old, being beaten through a table. Then the next week I took him to lunch and he shared his story sober. And I was honored that he trusted me enough with his story, I've talked with guys I talked with boys who were sexually trafficked by their own families. Some people grew up, just in a household of prostitution. Hell, yeah, my dad was a pimp. And so what they saw as normal was very abnormal. But the life lessons people learned, one guy that I work with very, very close, a good friend of mine, was in jail for a while. But then when he told me about his upbringing, I could do nothing but cry. And part of me wants to say, well, why aren't you doing better? And then part of me realizes, with all he's gone through, it's amazing he's still here. And I told people about trauma not to justify what they're doing in their lives right now, but to explain it.
To understand.
We have to understand it. You know what? If we just come at it from an addiction standpoint, we're not going to be successful. If we come at it from a housing standpoint, we're not going to be successful. The group that I work with, by and large, very traumatized, very lacking in hope, don't think the system can help them at all, very lonely, they feel anonymous, and they feel let go by the system. And if you have no hope for tomorrow, who cares what you do today? Feeling that their lives are worthless. And I don't care what the government program is, it's not going to solve that issue. And journeying with people. We hadn't, about a month ago, it was raining and cold as heck. And the city came by and swept the tents. But inside the tents were jackets and sleeping bags. And so people were now left out in the street without any cold weather gear. And it's when it was getting to 35 degrees at night in Salinas. But I had just done a big clothing drive, so I had a bunch of jackets and blankets. So I handed out maybe 100 jackets and 150 blankets that night. Just opened up my parking lot in Chinatown and just a steady stream. And one guy came up to me just out of the blue and said, you know what, David? The city took away our hope today, but you've just restored it. But it wasn't the giving of jackets and blankets. And it wasn't just me. I had a group down there handing stuff out. They saw the love on the people's faces. And they said, our brothers and sisters are in need and we're here to help. And they felt loved and part of a community. And that brought hope. My kids were there. Oh, it was amazing. My 6-year-old at the time, handing out jackets. And she's just slowly getting it. We're there to help, but to journey. And the community aspect, letting people feel like they are a part of something, is the core of what I'm doing. That's where I have felt called to be. Other folks are more on the service side, and God has called them there. We need the service side, don't get me wrong, but we need the community side.
Yeah, and shifting our paradigm for how we deliver services. Even the idea of delivering services, we often do it through a paradigm that's basically, are you familiar with the framework of need-based, service-based versus place-based, asset-based?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, need-based, service-based is you go into a community. This is what's very needed after a disaster, for example. You go into a community and you survey all their needs. And for example, they're hungry. They're going to, they need food. Okay, that's, food's very important. But if they don't have clean water, you better address the clean water first because they'll die of the clean water before they'll starve to death, So it's like, and then you provide services around the most important need. You rank the needs. That's an important paradigm after, a disaster. The problem is that's pretty much the only paradigm we use, where to actually brings sustained change is the paradigm of place-based, asset-based. So you serve the community, like the way you went in and you rented a place embedded in this community in Chinatown. And now, rather than viewing them as problems, there's also assets.
Yep.
There's people there. There's leaders in each of this homeless. There's community that's happening there. There's people who are looking out for others. You know, one of a previous guests shared that there's two guys this was another shelter in somewhere in the East Bay, I think, Fremont area. And there's two guys there, and they're the ones who are guarding the encampment so that girls don't get beat up.
Yep.
You know?
Yep.
And we need to see the humanity there and then build that up, and we partner with them.
But even going beyond assets and seeing the strengths that these folks have, we always use the term brother and sister. Hey, brother, how you doing? Hey, sister, what's going on? And one day it struck me, would I treat my biological brother the way I treat that person? And if I don't, then I should not call that person my brother. And I took that seriously. If I'm really gonna call you brother, But one example is I had a guy once, 70 years old, African American crack addict, in Chinatown. All I heard is David down the street. So I stopped what I was doing. Well, okay, let's go down there. I go, what's going on? And he was covered in feces. And he goes, I had to go to the bathroom. My friends intentionally locked me out of the bathroom because they knew I would poop myself all over. And he just kept going for me like, this is what my life has come to. All I can get as a friend is somebody who wants to laugh at me for pooping myself. And he was sobbing and angry and hurtful. Now, the need-based issue would have to bring him to a bathroom. Here's a bathroom. Go clean yourself up. That's not what he needed. So I held him. And I said, you're okay. I'm not okay. You're loved. I'm not loved. You have work. Oh, I know. All my life has come to. But I just let him, almost like a father soothing a child that's screaming. I wouldn't let him go. After about 20 minutes of this, I said, hey, do you want to come down to my building and get clean? He's like, yeah. Took him down the street, brought him into my bathroom, put gloves on because he couldn't clean himself. I helped clean him and gave him clothes. It's funny, when I look at that story, in some ways it seems so natural to have done what I did. But 10 years ago, there's no way in heck I would have done that.
So now it's natural for you.
And so I've grown, and I can see that. So when I tell someone that story, they're like, oh my goodness, I would never do that. I said, you know what? If you work with me for 6 months, you might. Because I see people who come into it from a very service-based mindset slowly start to see people as family, as brothers and sisters in life. And so my heart has grown. My ability to love has grown. And it wasn't like I patted myself on the back for being a good person. Like when I tell that story, it's not to pat myself on the back. I marvel at how much I've grown through my service. Because 10 years ago, I would have run the other direction. And sometimes I still wonder, what was I thinking? But there was such a deep love in my heart that it was as if my child came to me. We've all had little kids. I'm not going to tell my 3-year-old, well, stop, pooping in your diaper. I don't know. I couldn't explain it, but I had such a love for this man. And all I wanted to do was to make him feel dignity again. And what's interesting is there are other people down in Salinas who want that. I have different churches coming down, and I don't have to ask them to do stuff. And they come down to help me, but they're the ones going out in the street. Well, maybe I'm back in the building doing something. They're the ones going out. So it's not like what I'm doing is singular. Once you toss that idea out there, people are like, you know what? I want to be a part of that. And I think they like helping out with me because it takes the fear away of doing it on your own.
Yeah, if you can build a bridge. I've had a similar experience in prison, just I mean, they're not addicts there. It's a different path, but you get more out of it than you give. And, so like I wake up early during the season to go play basketball in prison, and people think, oh, well, you're such a saint. I'm like, no, but it's the funnest place ever.
Right.
And it's just progressive, but there's needs, for me, it was my friend Bill Epling. He kept inviting me, finally drugged me down there, to get me started. And then it's like, so now I'm leading a team.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And when I go down there, to Chinatown and Salinas, I'm just feeling joy. Like, I feel like I'm being ministered
It's
to.
the highlight of your week, yeah.
The same thing when people are like, oh my God, no, I'm not. It is the highlight of my week.
So this also reformed in your recovery, right? You were in AA, right? What
Yes.
was that? Was that after you got out of the rehab center?
Yep. So I was in AA, and it was important for me to take my AA seriously because I can have an addictive personality, and I knew I could fall back. I started going to AA at the church that housed AA groups with the homeless. Instead of being in Carmel or Pacific Grove or Monterey, they had great groups there, and I would attend them and have fun. But there was something about the groups of homeless at AA who it struck me that their journeys were very similar to mine.
Well,
The pain of growing
probably
up.
their journey is very, very similar to the other guys in Carmel too. It's just two different paths. One is self-destructive, the other is high performing, but
Yes.
self-destructive as well underneath.
But just hearing those stories, I think knocked me down a few pegs when I realized that, my journey wasn't all that different from the people on the streets in a lot of very key ways. And I think it was important for me to see. We're all human.
And I met some of the guys at one of the events, or a couple of the events. You've introduced me to the guys that helped you through, and amazing, and like they, like I go to prison, one of my friends who was a guest on here, Brian, who, he's out now, but he was running the media department. He was the GM for the San Quentin Warriors, and
Yeah.
like I learned so much, he mentors me, all the time, like one of the things, he was in prison, we're in prison, and he's giving a talk at halftime, just to sharing a little, and he's saying perspective. He says, like, you guys, you don't know how good you got. He says, like, complain about sitting in traffic. It's like, I can't wait to be stuck in traffic.
Yeah.
And I always think of that. So like whenever I'm, thinking of getting PO'd because I'm stuck in traffic, I'm like, I'm stuck in traffic. What a beautiful blessing.
Yeah.
I'm not stuck in solitary confinement. I'm not in San Quentin,
I used that similar concept. Somebody was complaining about where they were in life. They were living in a shelter. And I said, a year ago, where did you want to be? Oh, I wanted to be in that shelter. So you're where you've wanted to be. You're on that step. Don't worry about the next step. Today, you make it count. So changing that perspective around is kind of fun.
And we get so much more out of it. I love your name, Closer Walk, because that was the whole point. It was about we get closer to God as we, like God was telling you, or, this inspiration. You're just sitting on a park bench next to a homeless person, and that's it. And and we, we can be enriched so much,
Yeah. And several of the volunteers who I'm working with are still living on the streets and in tents, trying to change their life. And it's difficult. It's a slow process. Healing from trauma is a very slow process. And I'm not a licensed therapist. I'm not, a mental health professional, but I can, at least as part of the journeying process, begin to help them see themselves in a new light. But that's a long process. One of my good friends, who I met at one of the shelters, who then came to work with me and was off and on homeless. there's probably more days that frustrated the heck out of me with him than I was like, okay, I mean, it really was like the stock market, up and down, up and down, up and down. And he annoyed the heck out of me so many times. But now he has a job. He's living in a house. He's married and has a child.
And he's volunteering with you, right?
But now he's volunteering in Fresno. He's moved to Fresno.
Oh, okay.
But he was with me for 3 years. And
so it's like the stock market. It's up and down, but you got to think long term.
So he's
long term.
He was at my house the other day, and for his son's second birthday, and he was there with his wife, and they're just hanging out, eating burgers, and you're like, you know what? When you take a step back, you can see the progress. Day to day, sometimes not, but when you take a step back, I'm like, wow, what God has done in his life, and what he's allowed God to do in his life, and what he's allowed his therapist to do, and he's put in a lot of hard work trying to root out some of the demons and traumas he's grown up with. And you're like, okay, if he can do it, I know other folks can too.
We also have to think generationally, like it's not about, it's about changing the trajectory. I mean, what we're looking in, the problems that we see where, homelessness, chronic homelessness is now just so out of control. And now it's clearly in front of everybody's eyes. These are the fruit of seeds and brokenness that, go back generations.
Yes.
And it's about breaking that cycle of generational poverty, brokenness.
And I think one of the things when you come from generational brokenness is somebody can put a pathway in front of you and you still say, why bother?
It was like,
I'm going to fail on step 3 anyway.
The issue with you, like you're an alcoholic. You have to decide, do I want to be an alcoholic or you weren't an alcoholic because you were poor and broke or didn't have a wife or didn't have lovely kids. You're attracted to something that's toxic because it's your identity. It's what you're comfortable with. And it's even worse if when you're growing up, like one of my friends, Stuart Perelliot, I met him through his work in San Quentin prison, and he's been a guest here and a good friend. He has a nonprofit called Man to Man, and his is all about addressing fatherlessness. When he wrote his thesis initially, he grew up in East Oakland. It's like, how did East Oakland go from this thriving, vibrant community to the brokenness and the murder capital? And his thesis was, the young people screwed it all up. Then as he tried to dove in a little deeper, it's like, why were the young people screwing up? Because the fathers were absent and not there. Why were the fathers not absent and not there? They weren't equipped. They didn't know. So now it's all about, rebuilding fathers. That's what his nonprofit is about. But one of the things he said that hit me so much is, he grew up his whole life, everyone around him telling him you'll never make it past 16. And he's looking around and that's what's happening. And he says, when that's your framework, like he was given a full ride basketball scholarship to UCLA. This guy's the elite. And he turned it down to basically go sell drugs. Like, why would you do that? He said, I figured I'd do that later. I'm like, but then the line that is why I brought this up. He says, when you grow up, everyone telling you you're never going to make it past 16, you have no framework for making good long-term decisions.
That's right. I used to do juvenile prison ministry in New York City. And 14, 15, 16-year-old boys in jumpsuits and handcuffs walking in. And I did it for about a year and a half. I always ask one question. Is there somebody in your life who loves you unconditionally? And all the boys would always raise their hand. I said, okay, great. Who? About 95% was grandma. The other 5% was some mixture of grandfather, mother, aunt, or uncle. I never once had a boy in juvie tell me that they felt unconditional love from their father. Never once. And I realized we don't have a crime problem, we have a father problem. But it goes back to identity. Who am I? Oh, I'm the kid who's not worth enough for my dad to be in my life. I grew up, my dad left when I was 2 years old. So I'd be sitting there in church praying the Our Father who art in heaven. God's a father. So God's going to abandon me too. identity issues.
Do you know, here I have something like this. I think the name Daniel means God is my judge. What emotional response does that make you feel?
Oh, not good.
Good, okay. God is my judge, okay. The Hebraic understanding of that is quite different. See, this is how we're so programmed and how we read into this our own brokenness, you know. God is our Father and God is our judge. So the emotional response is, I've screwed up. I'm in big trouble.
I'm in front of the judge.
Now I go in front of the judge.
Yeah.
The judge knows me and cares about me and is going to give me, he's just and he's free, but he's someone I can trust. He's my dad. I have an inside hook to him. He's going to look out for me. So it's something extremely comforting. Like, the pagans don't judge me. The people who hate me don't judge me. The world doesn't judge me. God, who's my Father and loves me, unconditionally judges me. But we can't understand that. But when I understood that, it's like quite eye-opening.
Yeah, it is.
God is my judge.
Yeah, but even today, saying God is my Father stirs up some negative emotions in me about fatherhood. That when I say, God is Abba, I can relax with the identity of God as a dad, a daddy, and I'm a child. Even though I never had that. When I was a child, I didn't have someone where I was like, Daddy! And my mom got remarried and I had a wonderful stepdad. Very loving. But part of me wanted my...
Of course. You're wired that way. That's how you're made.
And so when I'm dealing with the folks I'm dealing with right now, like, I understand in my own heart identity issues and feeling worthless. I remember just driving once when I was 25 and talking to my brothers and saying, guys, I'm unlovable. So not that I'm not being loved right now. I don't think I'm capable or worthy of being loved. And they looked at me like I was crazy. Like, where'd that come from? That's stupid.
What you're saying, when
I was about 25 years old. But somewhere deep in my soul, my identity was not just unloved, but unlovable. And
where's your father now?
he passed away. He came back into my life when I was about 30, and then a couple years later, he passed away. And you carry that.
And it's a process. It's ongoing healing, and it's understanding that, I think that's the paradigm shift we need to make, certainly as people of faith. Okay, certainly. This is what, it's not about going out and being the savior of the world. If we believe Jesus already did that, we don't have to do the heavy lifting, there. And it's just about being obedient. And then once you get started, once you get into it, you realize you get more out of it than you give. It gives you perspective. And I think if we can change our perspective on that, and stop seeing it as a problem that needs to be solved so much as, our whole problem, community that needs to be restored. Our own humanity needs to be restored. And if instead of seeing it as a problem, like, here's my big dream. You study the history of California, and it's pretty dark. We call it the gold rush, and it was really a genocide by every definition of the word, although that's a modern term. They didn't have it at the time. Just horrible. And, you have the whole world coming to California trying to get this little shiny metal.
Mm-hmm.
And what we did to the people that were already here, the indigenous people, just wiped them out, just horrific. And I was thinking about that, and it's like, you know what? That's like a bunch of people running into a field, trying to pick up pennies. And in the process of picking up pennies, they're smashing and destroying $100 bills. What if our destiny was a new gold rush, but instead of trying to mine a metal, we mined what was most valuable, which is human beings, the human spirit. And what if the whole world comes to California because we're learning how to mine? Like if we can change our view of Chinatown from just this ugly, horrible thing because we're focusing on these feces to wait, these are gold nuggets that need to be mined. And yes, there is ugly, horrible darkness around that. But the thing inside is so valuable. And if we do that,
Well, if the people I see are so creative, necessity is the mother of invention. The folks on the streets that I'm dealing with, they have solutions to everything. They can MacGyver whatever you need. If you need, hey, I need this done. Oh, we'll take these two wires, put them together. Let me do this. We'll bring this over. We'll take that apart. It just blows my mind, the creativity. One of the guys that I see every day, he's got a bachelor's degree in English. Bright guy. A lot of the folks that I work with are very bright. But they're all really talented with their hands. I mean, you'd be shocked to see they can put things back together and see the potential in what I would consider junk in ways that I never could. And if they were put into work and use that creativity got harnessed and that ability, the total asset.
and who better to help the homeless community than someone who's been there and done that and come out? And if we can empower them, I mean, that's why I'm a big fan of our mutual friend, Vanessa Russell, Love Never Fails.
Yep.
There's a huge intersection that's a whole nother podcast between homelessness and human trafficking, like you touched on. But one of the things that's impressed me so much is that Love Never Fails, 90% of their staff are survivors of interpersonal trauma, violence. And 40% of them are survivors of human trafficking. So, when you see these overwhelming stats or these pictures of, like the human trafficking problem that fills stadium after stadium after stadium of people who are just in the U.S. are being trafficked, it can be overwhelming. But then I think, wow, I know these young ladies and they are the most powerful forces and advocates. In fact, I've interviewed them on this podcast, and like, oh, wow, out of that massive, that's not just a bunch of victims. These are potential leaders.
Yep.
And then I go from despair to hope. It's like, oh, wow, if we can shift our perspective, that is an unrealized and unmined asset. And if we can come with that perspective and that paradigm, then we'll unlock this. And I believe this is I believe this is key to us creating the world, the future that we want, of human flourishing for everyone.
Here's the problem. I have some glimpse of what the people I'm journeying with are going through, but I've never been drug addicted living on the street. And so there's a limit to what I can do. The people who need to step up as the leaders are people who have been on the streets and drug addicted, going through mental health crises. But the problem is this: society won't let them rise to the position of leadership. I've got a friend who's a sex offender, 290 status. He, very well spoken, hurt, but working on it, kicked out of his church once they learned he was a 290. When it comes to alcohol, drug abuse, homelessness, there is such a distrust that you're not seen as a victim. You are seen solely as the criminal, and in some ways beyond redemption. And the churches have not stepped up to allow our unhoused folks into their communities. They smell funny. They look funny. Churches want to promote come as you are, but not at the expense of our rich donors leaving. And so how do we grow people into leaders when the one institution that should most talk about rehabilitation and understanding and acceptance and change?
You know, we have a theology of, we're no better than anyone else. We're all sinners. We're saved by grace. It's the same grace. I mean, we've all heard so many great messages about it. The issue is walking that out. So what's the solution? How do you solve this?
And so what I've been doing, is bringing the churches down and working with me and allowing them to, but not just on a once basis. You had to come every month. So I've had churches have come now 20 times over the last couple of years, 30 times over the last 2.5 years. And they have to get out from behind the tables and talk with people. Because as much as we want to grow, the folks in the street into the leaders that they can then help other people, part of my ministry is growing Christians into Christians.
Yeah.
And it's hard. It is hard. And that's a mission field. In and of itself is getting the church to really see itself.
You were in church, you were doing great, you were a leader, and yet you're addicted. You're an alcoholic underneath. And how common is that? We're broken. I mean, I saw this one heat map of this talk. It was like at a conference. This woman was talking about sexual addiction in our society. And then she gave a heat map of what the church looks like on Sunday. And so you could visualize what it means that in our society, 3 out of 4 men between a certain age are regular users of pornography. So in other words, they're addicted.
Yep.
Okay. And then she showed it as a heat map. The thing that sticks out the most is the pulpit was hotter than other areas, which, again, I don't like to say that to throw pastors under the bus, because it's the fact is that we as a faith community have not solved this issue yet. Okay. But so we're no better than society. And so what is outside has to be inside. And one of the factors that the pulpit is that sexual addiction is the same and actually higher in the pulpit than it is in the pew, is because the pulpit attracts that type of personality, someone who's outgoing. So it's not, regardless, it's a very bad problem that we need to solve.
Yes. This idea of helping the church to sort of walk out its mission. We do a Christmas dinner at Sacred Heart, or Christmas lunch at Sacred Heart every Christmas day. About 500 people from the community come, a lot of whom are homeless. And our finance manager, he showed up. He said, "Hey, what do you want me to do?" I said, "Oh, you see that table of 5 folks over there? Sit with them." And he looked at me like, "Are you crazy?" And it was funny because I knew all the guys, great guys. But he just looked at them and said, "They're unhoused." So he went and sat with them, and I didn't pay much more attention to it. A year later, he shares with me a story. He said, "David, I don't feel comfortable around homeless. It makes me, I don't know what to say or do. Am I going to be attacked? Am I not going to be safe?" He's like, "So when people come up to me, my first reaction is to push them away." He said, a couple of weeks ago, this is the next Christmas, he goes, a homeless guy knocked on the parish door on Christmas Eve and said he needed $80 for a bus to Fresno. And my first reaction was like, "No, get away." He goes, "But I remember sitting with those men the year before at the Christmas dinner and realized they were just like me." He said, "I'm going to help this guy." So he sat down and talked to them, found out that he had skills in working in a car garage as a mechanic, called up another friend of his who was a mechanic saying, "Hey, do you need any help for a day? I got a homeless guy here, but he's a mechanic. Would you pay him $80 to do a day's worth of labor for you?" He said, "Of course I would." So the guy went there the day after Christmas, worked for the full day, and got his bus fare to get his bus out to Fresno. Total win-win situation. The guy felt dignity. He earned his money. He said he was smiling. But what this guy shared with me was it was because he had sat down a year before with people and broke bread with them that a lot of his stigmas were pushed away.
And I would argue this is hard, but this is also the pathway to influence. Like, if we can do this, if we become known as we're the ones that take care of the poor, and we do it with passion and we do it with excellence, the faith communities are becoming more and more irrelevant.
Yep.
But if we can, not the ones that are doing this, if we do this, we'll have influence, tremendous influence. In fact, I would say that was the secret as to why, whether you agree with Christianity or not, as to whether that's the faith creed you choose or not, it's pretty objective that it was one of the, if not the fastest growing people movement in the history of history, pretty much. How did they go from this tiny little sect in this backwater, province of Rome, of the Roman Empire, to then, influencing the entire Roman Empire in such a short period of time, reaching the end of the earth in England and all over. And I would submit that the secret was they were very, very good of taking, they changed their identity. You had slave owners, the wealthiest people ever, who would sit down and eat with slaves because now they had a new identity in this faith. And that stuck out from everybody else. And in a world which was defined by crisis, they were the only ones that reached out across party lines to care for others. And that's what made their offering so extremely compelling.
So let me stop you there on that concept of new identity, because in Christianity, I'll just use that as an example. We become a new creation. But what I learned in my own life was I thought I was becoming a new creation. And I had the power of being, working with God, the Holy Spirit. After 3 years of working on the streets with the homeless, I have an ability to love that is so much deeper than what I had before. I didn't realize how stunted my own Christianity really was. And it was that people were looking at me, oh, you're a saint. I was getting all kinds of praise. But when I look back on that time period, I was a 1 out of 10. And I didn't even know it. And what I realize now is like, oh, this is what it feels like to truly love another person. And it's not me. I'm filled up with, the power of the Holy Spirit, and He's changing my life, but I'm seeing it changed. And I'm seeing promises come true in my life that I had just read about in a book and thought, oh, maybe that's just not for me. And I think a lot of Christians have that example or have that feeling. I thought it would be more than this. And
buyer's remorse. People come into the faith and they're longing for a transformation, and maybe they experience for a little while, and then now it's like, is this all there is? And we'll say, no, that's not all there is.
No,
you'll hang out with someone like David, and you'll see, no, it's this ongoing renewal, and yes, it gives you a perspective, and you touch into a life that is just worth living because it has significance.
Yes, and you get grown in the process, and I feel more alive now with the ministry I'm doing than before. And it's because I have been grown through my outreach. Through my service, I have learned what it comes to become a Christian. I would never learn just in church or in reading and in prayer. And I think that's the missing component.
Get out there and do it.
That's right.
Like, go out there and do it. There's nothing, so our faith is built around what we say we believe, we talk, we hear, we go. Find your niche, find what you're called to, and go and do the stuff that changes everything.
And what's fun for me is most of my volunteers and churches that come down are Christian, but I've got some folks who are humanist, atheist, Jehovah's Witness, and Mormon, or Jewish, and it's like, do you love people? Yes. Do you see Do you see them as your brothers and sisters? Yes. Come on down. So there is something universal, and anybody can grow when they open up their heart to another human being.
Yeah, it blows your mind. I have another question I wanted to ask you because I'm learning something new about you now. I hadn't understood the time frame but you mentioned earlier you lost your son, and I know you had a very unique experience through that, and lost him to a drunk driver.
Yeah.
I'm understanding the time frame more though about how you came for healing of that. Do you want to talk further about that? Like tell the story of losing your son and what happened at the court case?
Yeah, let me just take a quick step back. As I mentioned before, sort of growing up with that feeling of being unlovable, I took that feeling into my marriage. And even with my wife, there was a part of my heart I wouldn't give her because I didn't want to be hurt. But you can't have a marriage that way. We were infertile, and so we decided to become foster parents. And this boy, Sebastian, was 3 months old when he came into our lives, and we ultimately adopted him. I remember one night, and he's about 1 year old. He's laying there in the crib, and it was as if he reached up into my heart and unlocked that piece of my heart that was still locked off. And like, I want all of you, Daddy. And in that moment, it was the first time I'd ever truly given myself without reservation to another human being. And over the next 3.5 years, just the joys of watching a child grow. He was old beyond his years. At 3 years old, if he saw a person playing by themselves in the park, he'd run across, grab their hand. Oh, you don't have to play alone. Come play with us. And so in 2009, one night, my wife and I were out with our kids, drove home in separate cars. I got home before my wife, and she had the kids with her, and she didn't make it home. And so I started calling her, where are you? It was late on a Sunday night, and we wanted to get the kids to bed. And so I went out to go look for her, and off in the distance, I just see a bunch of cop cars. My first thought is, oh, great, my wife's stuck behind the cop cars. Then I went back out to the main intersection, and in the middle of the intersection was my car, my wife's car. And CHP came up and said, can I help you? I just said, that's my car. They sat me down and said, somebody's been hurt. There was an accident. Came back about 10 minutes later and said, Mr. Balch, I don't know how to tell you this, but one of your children is dead. And it's kind of like it is in the movies, the pain, And at that moment, helicopter took off because my wife was being life-flighted to the hospital. She was stopped at a red light, and a drunk driver hit her, and he hadn't stopped. So I drove up to the hospital, up to Valley Medical in San Jose, and I remember very vividly those next 3 nights. It's almost like magical thinking. You don't know what to believe. The pain was so real, so gut-wrenching. It's almost like I couldn't breathe. And after a couple of days, my wife was getting better, a little bit better, because she was in and out of consciousness. She had a traumatic brain injury, and I could go ahead. They said, okay, you can now talk to her about what happened. And so I mentioned to her, she goes, oh, how's Sebastian? And I said, oh, honey, our son died in the accident. And with a very flat affect, she was like, oh, what a shame. He was our first. We'll need to plan a funeral. It's like, what? And then about half a minute later, she's like, but is he okay? Is he upstairs? Is he going to be okay? And I was like, I've lost my wife too. And fortunately, she got better. About a year later, she was fully recovered from the brain injury. She's a doctor, still practicing. But in that moment, I dropped to my knees as angry. And I said to a friend of mine, God has this wrong. I don't have the strength for this. And he said, David, that's the problem with men. We think we're supposed to be strong. He's like, let yourself be weak and just let God fill you up. And in that moment, I had a choice. I can either run away and nobody would have blamed me. God, I've served you for 20 years now. This is what you do to me. But instead I said, Lord.
I would have blamed you, but boy.
But I said, Lord,
no end there.
I can't. I can't do this. You take over. And just crazy stuff started happening. I was driving down the highway a couple days later, going back home to Salinas, and I just said, Lord, give me a sign that my boy's with you. I just heard a voice, turn on the radio. So I turned the radio on. The first song that came on was I Know You're in Heaven with God, and I'm rejoicing for you. My heart breaks because I miss you. A couple months later, same thing, same song. A couple months after that, on what would have been his 5th birthday, I'm driving right by the accident site, turn radio on, that song comes on. Okay, God, I had to go see him at the funeral home. And it's like in the movies, you're on a steel table and I'm standing outside the door and I'm like, if I don't knock and I don't go in and I don't see him, this never happened. And I knew I had to go in. I said, Lord, I can't do this. I felt a hand on my shoulder and a peace flooded my soul unlike anything I've ever seen, ever felt. Floated in, picked up my boy, hugged him, kissed him, sang him songs. Oh, who lived on the pineapple under the sea? Tom and Jerry. And when it was over and I'm walking back out, it all came crashing back down on me. It wasn't like God saying, hey, life's going to be great. God was saying, I will be with you forever. And that peace has never left me. Which is funny because it was a couple years after that my alcoholism really started to blossom. And so it was almost like on 2 tracks.
Well, they see that seed there, and the Lord's not going to just give you peace and leave that seed there. So that has to come to a certain place. Yeah. That's what the Lord saw the end, and he saw the destiny, and he was going to uproot it. See, he was forcing the issue.
Yeah.
So you could be healed of this.
I have a peace right now that is indescribable. When I was diagnosed with cancer, I said, it's okay. God's got this. Not in the sense that I'm going to be healed. I said, either I'm going to be healed or I'm going to die. I said, and if I die, I trust that God will have my family. And there was such a deep peace there that really struck me like, wow, where'd that come from? But it's just there. I trust in God in a way. But again, even that's grown since I've worked with the homeless because my ability to see my own identity and other people's identities as children of God has helped me on my spiritual journey. It's helped me with my cancer diagnosis. It's helped me with my cancer journey. I've got folks on the street coming up to me, hey, David, how are your last scans? We've been praying for you, brother. And I'm just looking at it like it's crazy. You think, oh, they're mean, they're angry, they're on the streets. No, they're coming up to me. Hey, can I give you a hug, man? I've been praying for you. All of this is part of one journey. It's apropos of nothing, but I had a guy come up to me on the street a couple of months ago going, I got 90 days sobriety thanks to you, David. I was like, that's awesome. What did I do? And he goes, one day you were on the sidewalk. He offered me a cup of coffee. I was like, okay, what else did I do? And he's like, oh, no, you didn't do anything else. But in that moment, I felt human. And I'm like, you know what? I am going to get sober. It just reminds me that as we journey, just in love with each other, we grow, but seeds are being planted in other people and they are being grown in ways we don't understand.
That's so beautiful, and you're ministering to me far more than we don't talk enough. So the part of this was selfish. I just wanted to catch up.
Oh yeah.
So I think we've got to run. You're gonna go share it at We Heart SF. So we got to wrap this right now. But right now give me. I'd like to close this trigger warning. I'm going to close this by praying for you.
Okay.
And I hope this doesn't weird anyone out, but I'm going to pray for you. And
can I give you a specific prayer need?
Absolutely.
So I am meeting later this week with the mayor of Salinas, who I think would like to start getting more of the faith community going in building community with our unhoused neighbors. Not just the service side of it, but to really start becoming places of welcome. And so I would pray that those discussions with the mayor, and then maybe a mayor's breakfast with the faith community comes out of it, or just more work with the faith community comes out. But that journey of making our churches, synagogues, mosques, places of welcome for our unhoused neighbors and places of healing, that process would bear fruit.
creating a safe place like you have a Closer Walk
Exactly.
or relatively a safe place where people can come and it can be a bridge and people can come and meet each other and build the relationships. I think that's a huge need, and that's a big step in solving that issue. You're also, where are you at? You're in your second bout with the...
I am. Tumors are still growing, and the treatments so far haven't worked as effectively as we had hoped. And so now we're starting the experimental trial process. Sometimes I think a little bit of Dante when I hear experimental trial. Abandon all hope, ye who enter. But there's always hope.
All right.
So pray for that.
There is hope, and I love your perspective. So, Father, I just bring my friend David before you, and I bless him. And Lord, he is such an inspiration to me and how he lives his life. Lord, I even asked him how I could pray for him, and he's talking about his mission and how he can influence Salinas. And we pray that Salinas and the faith community in Salinas will lead the way in building a community and transforming the way we look at our neighbors as fellow human beings and of need and of made in your image and of divine asset. And we want to go out and reach out and do these things, not because we need to help them like we're the saviors, but because of because we're all made in your image, Lord. And I pray for him and Mayor Dennis and that their conversation. And I also pray for David and his family. And if it be your will, heal him. Provide an experimental treatment, Lord, that heals his cancer, Father. And if it's your will for you to take him home, I thank you that you're going to allow him to fulfill his destiny while he's here. And you're going to take care of his family and his loved ones and his ministries when you take him, Lord. Thank you that we can trust in you. Amen. Amen. Thank you so much. And thank you for watching this. Thank you for being my guest.